Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. It has been a bit longer than I intended since I filmed my last Reads and Rambles video, and I have a bit of personal catching up to do, as well as some bookish conversation to engage with you. First, my spouse David and I were able to make appointments 2 weeks ago for our first doses of the COVID vaccine, and our 21-year-old son got his first shot yesterday morning. All three of us received the Moderna vaccine. As for side effects, David was fine. I had roughly a day of delayed onset headache and nausea, and so far our son has a very sore arm, is exhausted, and has a lot of muscle soreness. Compared to the complications we've all seen from folks who've struggled with a COVID diagnosis, all of the side effects seem totally worth it. Just being able to regain a slight bit of confidence about our daily lives, whether they are outdoor walks in the suburbs or the opportunity to see my now vaccinated mother as she undergoes medical treatment, feels amazing. David and I will get our second shots in a couple of weeks and acquire our immunity superpowers a couple of weeks after that. Phenomenal. On the afternoon we got our first shots, my husband and I decided to celebrate just a bit by driving through a neighborhood filled with blossoming cherry trees. In normal years, when our family is healthy and there's no global pandemic, our goal is always to walk along the paths in downtown Washington, D.C., lined with hundreds of trees. But for a variety of reasons, we have sometimes chosen to walk or drive through this neighborhood on the border of D.C. and Maryland. It was a beautiful day when we went this year, and there were so many people walking around that we decided to stay in the car. Most of my pictures are through the windshield, but let me show you just a little bit. While seeing all the trees together, creating a neighborhood full of blossoms is pretty amazing, I actually can see both a weeping cherry tree and a redbud from my spot in bed. When I look out in the morning, this is what I see. One of the other major happenings in our lives since the last time I filmed our Reads and Rambles was our celebration of Passover. On the first night, my husband and I had a quick little Seder ourselves, filling our Seder plate with everything from a roasted beet, a vegetarian replacement for a shank bone, to an orange, a nod to the Jewish lesbian feminist community. We have a couple of different Seder plates, but this amazing one we found at a Middle Eastern market in town. Technically, it was, I think, designed to be a serving platter for a Turkish mezza plate, but it is so perfect for Pesach that we just had to bring it home. On the second night, we had a Zoom Seder, along with friends we've known for more than 30 years. In fact, we celebrated Passover with them all those years ago, but haven't since we all left grad school and settled all around North America until the pandemic made the idea of a Zoom celebration seem perfectly reasonable. By the end of the evening, we were all committed to the idea that next year we might try to be together virtually again from all our disparate locations. Although it's not traditional at all, we had a third night Seder this year, around a fire pit in our friend's driveway, keeping our distance but loving the evening together. And on the last night, the eighth night for those of us not in Israel, we ate one last special matzah treat, s'mores, with matzah, Nutella, and roasted marshmallows. A delicious way to end the holiday. Most people end their Seders by all saying, "Next year in Jerusalem." Some people mean it literally, and some people mean it metaphorically, next year in a place of hope or freedom. This year, many people ended their Seders with next year in person, with other people. Although, of course, it was not quite the same. I found it very meaningful to realize how, over the course of the year, we'd created a variety of ways to feel like we were together with some of our friends, even though we haven't been. Well, on to more bookish talk. A few weeks ago, I mentioned the writing of Tilly Olson as an answer to a tag question about Marxist characters or something. Much to my pleasure, a front page feature appeared in the New York Times Book Review the next weekend. I might talk about it another time, but for now I'll just link to the article if I remember and just mention a related thing. In this current week's New York Times Book Review, there was a great letter about that Tilly Olson feature, one that really made me think about the connection that literature offers us. The author of the letter mentions that many years ago, Tilly Olson came to speak to a college literature class she was teaching. While Olson was talking off the cuff, she decided to share some lines of poetry that she had always found deeply moving from Hart Crane. She started reciting the works by heart without preparation. Here's what the author of the letter says next. At one point in the second stanza, her memory faltered. I had memorized Legend a few years before and was one of the high points of my academic life to, unbidden, join her in voicing Crane's lines until she found the thread again, and to see her eyes widen with pleasure at the unexpected duet. Amazing. I love these moments of recognition when we see how our experiences of literature unite us in all sorts of ways, no matter how different we are. I can't imagine how special that moment was to both Tilly Olson and the writer of the letter to the New York Times. Quite often when I talk about the New York Times Book Review, I mention what is usually my favorite page, the By the Book interview. In this most recent issue, Cynthia D'Aprix Sweeney, an author I haven't read before, gives a number of answers that make me think I might like her, including the fact that she only recently read George Eliot's Middlemarch for the first time and loved it. She had started the novel in September, but just could not focus on it until January 20th, a day when many of us Americans might say exactly what she says. All this space in my brain freed up, and I was able to settle right back in. Yes, indeed. Sweeney also responds to a question about what books she considers guilty pleasures, saying that while she feels no guilt about reading anything, she takes great comfort from a certain kind of book. Somewhere in the United Kingdom in an earlier era, women of a certain age, are they sisters? So much the better, looking for love or unhappy with love, or completely cynical about love. Long walks, tea time, gardening. Throw in a meddling great aunt and an untrustworthy suitor. Is there a vicar? I'm in. Pretty much any Barbara Pym fits the bill here. This quote made me smile and absolutely sigh in recognition, perhaps especially in this post-inaugural United States. But I would love to hear from some of you Brits if this might sound unintentionally offensive. On top of that, I also see how it highlights a potentially blind kind of social privilege. Clearly, those of us who respond to this imagery are dreaming about a world with only very safe kinds of tension. Nobody shot by the police at traffic stops, or separated from their families at the border, or physically abused by their life partners. I am absolutely not blaming Sweeney here. I feel exactly as she does, to be honest, and take comfort in those Pym-like books. But I'm suddenly wondering if they might actually indeed be guilty pleasures. Please chime in if you have any thoughts about this. Okay, let's move on to a very brief mention of a different kind of comfort reading I've done recently, a kind with a bit more tension of a particular sort. Although I'm reporting on this reading belatedly, I read a couple of books for March Mystery Madness last month and really enjoyed both of them. One was the first book in the Inspector Gamache series by Louise Penny. I think I mentioned how much I was enjoying it in my last Reads and Rambles. Fairly early on, I already knew I would be reading many more in the series. I really enjoyed Penny's writing style and most of her characters and how they develop. I was not fully convinced by the portrayal of conflict between two of the detectives, but I assume that storyline is going to continue in future volumes in the series. The second mystery I read during the month of March was the first book in the Vera series written by Anne Cleeves. For several years, I really loved the television adaptations, and it took me a little while to adjust to the fact that the TV show and the novel version of Vera are slightly different. But by the end, that was all fine. One of the things that was really fascinating is that in the first book, Vera basically doesn't make an appearance until halfway through or so. I thought it worked brilliantly here, although I don't think I've ever read anything like that before. Have any of you seen this approach in other books? I thought the effect would make me feel disoriented, but not at all. It made me feel more connected to the crime story, to the emotions of the characters involved, or connected in some way to that crime, as well as to the world of the investigators. Thanks to all the hosts of March Mystery Madness who encouraged me to read these two books. It's been quite a while since I read mystery novels, and it was great fun. Next, I want to mention an interesting conversation that has recently popped up on BookTube about whether book reviews, formal ones, or what we do here on our channels or blogs, can be objective, or if they are merely subjective. Immediately before I sat down to film this video, I watched Brian's response to the issue over on his channel Bookish. He started by talking about visual art, showing two pictures of penguins, one by a talented artist and the other by his daughter when she was young. Audubon's penguin is, as Brian says, executed with more skill. If you've never seen that kind of penguin before in real life, his painting will give you quite a realistic image, a three-dimensional and specific rendering. Brian's daughter's penguin is not as skilled, as he says, but he likes it better, even if at some level he thinks that Audubon's painting is objectively better. I fully understand what he means, but I think there's another level to what jumps out when we compare these two works. Especially in a world where photography could reveal an even more precise representation of that penguin than Audubon did, we as viewers often place more value on the spirit of the thing, the imagination, the emotion behind what we're looking at. Brian's family penguin is spunky and charming and has a personality. And while I'm not suggesting that his daughter's work was that of an artist in full control of her skills yet, I think Brian loves her painting not only because he loves his daughter and loves the memories that he feels whenever he looks at her childhood art. I think most of us who looked at her penguin portrait felt a kind of energy from her work that made us like it in a way that might not be objective, but isn't completely subjective either. Let me steer off for just a second and tell a couple of stories about work my own child produced when he was young. First, we read aloud a great deal to each other. When Abe was a newborn and my husband was studying for medical examinations, David would sometimes read to Abe about allergic rhinitis, his voice lilting happily as if he were reading Dr. Seuss. I often read aloud about cultural hegemony or the place of creolization in folk stories. We read plenty of picture books and told plenty of stories too, and one day a very young Abe picked up one of my academic books, turned to a specific page, and very confidently started reading a story of his own devising. If I had not known what he was actually looking at, I swear I might have thought that full literacy had happened overnight. One day, while I had been revising my own writing on my laptop probably, Abe had been happily busy with pages of scrap paper and a yellow crayon. When I finished up, he handed me 10 pages or more, a relatively tight scrawl, and told me he had just finished writing his story. I was thrilled, flattered that he seemed to want to take after his mama and be a writer. I figured I would teach him later that first drafts in pale yellow crayon made it hard to revise later, but that could wait. Instead, I sat down and asked him to read it to me. His answer? I can't read cursive yet. You should read it to me. I felt a little stuck. I asked for some guidance from him, but he was insistent that I should just read it to him. I don't remember what I did, to be honest. Did I start reciting what I had just written in my own manuscript? what I might have just read and about the history of slavery somewhere. Or maybe I started in on my favorite Eudora Welty story, which I would have probably had under my tongue at that point. My son's writing of the story brought me great joy, even though, similarly to how Brian feels about his daughter's penguin, I can acknowledge that there are writers who are objectively better at what they produce than what my son had produced that day. There are clearly important objective evaluations when we read. Perhaps the key one being, can writers actually convey the story or the information they want to convey to their readers? Clearly, my young son's lack of skill in that department was more profound than what many writers struggle with, but not completely unrelated. Practice and maturity can make a lot of difference. Still, in general, I think the skills that we can judge completely objectively are a relatively small part of what we should value in art and literature. Being completely objective about works about humanity and our relationships with the world just can't be objective. Both fiction and the kind of nonfiction that most of us here on BookTube read, in other words, not exclusively about pure facts of objects, are almost definitionally concerned with the grammatical subject. How do people constitute themselves? How do people see the world? How do they interact with other people with their own subjectivity? These kinds of questions, this kind of observation or theme or plot line or whatever, are often exactly what makes novels or biographies or social histories extraordinarily powerful. How we as readers and reviewers come to judgments about these kinds of strengths in a book just cannot be purely objective. Nevertheless, just because book reviews shouldn't be strictly objective, that doesn't make criticism utterly subjective either. I'm going to argue that framing this question as objective versus subjective creates far more problems than it solves. Those words both imply extremes that just don't apply to responsible literary criticism. We often say objective when we mean rational or well thought out, and we often say subjective when we mean intensely personal in a highly idiosyncratic way. Sometimes on BookTube, we hear people talk about why they specifically respond negatively to a book. I sometimes say that my own personal dislike of books describing intense violence sometimes make me dislike books, which I nevertheless know do a lot of other things in ways I really respect or admire. Tag questions here on BookTube often ask us about particular tropes we personally hate, or particular times in our lives that might have shaped how much we appreciate a book or not appreciate a book. Those kinds of influences are not just subjective. They are idiosyncratic, at least to a degree. But as long as booktubers and formal reviewers and literary judges are quite aware of what is a highly idiosyncratic response, which other people are not necessarily likely to feel, it's quite possible for us to be rational reviewers. Our rational judgments and interpretations are, in fact, still subjective in those cases. We're using our individually unique collections of talents and skills to help try to build an argument that will make sense to other people. Anyone who reads and writes or watches and films reviews know that we often disagree about the quality of books. If our judgments were purely objective, there wouldn't be much to talk about. Our differing interpretations and judgments are exactly what makes it so exciting to be part of a bookish conversation. On the other hand, if our judgments were purely subjective in the idiosyncratic extreme, there isn't much to talk about there either. Bookish talk is boring if all we're saying is just that our personal reactions are exclusively our personal reactions. I think the pleasure of conversation relies on three things: people having different ideas from each other, people respecting that other people have reasonable different ideas, and perhaps most importantly, people playing their different ideas against each other in order to grow. In my parlance, at least, this kind of review is indeed subjective rather than objective, but also rational rather than idiosyncratic. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, or if you choose on your own channels. Speaking of reviews, I had the great excitement of getting to see proofs of a review I have coming out in a print journal at the beginning of May. Right around the same time, I have a review of another book coming out online. I can't really talk about either of them in any detail yet, but I think I'll be able to share links and conversation with you perhaps in my next Reads and Rambles. Thanks for being part of all these bookish conversations with me, including here on this channel. See you soon here on Anna's Books.